Whole horror.
Okay, everyone, I called the meeting, the Finance and Operations Committee at the 3 o'clock coveted time because it's the fun committee.
Late, you're late. You're late.
Anyways, we get the coveted 3 o'clock time. So, thank you to those who are joining us by way of live stream and those attending in our boardroom. I will note that Regent for Halen is joining us virtually online this afternoon. So, hello, Regent for Halen. I'd also like to welcome our student representative for today, Abiha Kashif from the Twin Cities campus, and is Madison Hilliard from the Crookston campus, who is attending virtually. Okay. So today's first item of business is to act on the new campus plan for the Crookston campus. I'll note that no additional changes have been made since the committee reviewed the plan in December. Here to provide us with the final framing of the campus plan are Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, Rosemary Johnson, Director of Planning, Monique McKenzie, and Chief Sustainability Officer, Shane Stennis. Chancellor Holt's class was called to the Capitol, so we appreciate you stepping in for her. Senior Vice Chancellor Johnson, with that, Director McKenzie, would you like to start us off?
Chair Hibbs, thank you very much. We're happy to be here at your committee meeting today. We're here for action following your December review of the campus and climate action plans. As you may recall from our last presentation, these plans are really the result, both the development of the plan and the recommendations, representing an aspirational view of each campus's future. The capital funding that is needed to drive implementation of these plans is not prescribed by your action today. As funding is available, new investments will be shaped by the recommendations of this plan. So just to be clear to you, we are not attaching a financial list of requirements. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Senior Vice Chancellor Johnson.
Chair Hibbs, other regents, I'm pleased to be here today to present the proposed campus climate and action plan for your final consideration. Undertaking this process allowed Crookston community members, faculty, staff, and students to explore both broadly and deeply many ideas about our campus as it is and as it might be. Some of the conversations highlighted challenges, while others presented great opportunities for the campus. These recommendations are based on what is currently known, and they are also intended to be a resource when future issues require additional decisions.
So as a reminder again to you, Regents, about why we undertake this kind of planning together in an integrated way, really the impetus to coordinate and integrate comes from two ambitious but mission-aligned goals. Number one, to support University of Minnesota Crookston's long-term strategic growth by guiding decisions about physical campus itself, facilities, spaces, landscapes, and all of those, of course, are in service of our mission, teaching and learning, student life, mobility, community connections. But the second equal and ambitious but also important goal is to advance a system-wide commitment to envision and build a sustainable future. Shane will speak more to that as we go through the presentation. With the leadership of Chancellor Mary and her team on campus, including Senior Vice Chancellor Johnson, we really work together with a consultant to realize the benefits of integrating like this and to really align both our principles for decision-making based both on engagement from our stakeholders and reinforcing the synergies that come from thinking about these things at the same time. I won't spend much time on this slide. We discussed it with you in our last presentation in December. Crookston sits in a very interesting region, very close to that North Dakota border. So it's certainly part of our regional economic and higher education landscape in that part of our state. So I'll just spend a minute talking about the big ideas here, just to remind you of what's in your docket, the full plan documents. Of course, this is very abbreviated. For each of our campus plans, we have tried to capture big ideas as a way to think about it in a shorthand. But the plans have a lot more details about which implementation, which initiatives we want to pursue. So the first one here for Crookston is about modernizing and reinvesting in the campus. There are many academic and administrative spaces on the campus today that are in need of that modernization. So we believe we can find space, make that space perform better by renovating in place. Part of that effort will require us to understand what the current needs are, whether they're pedagogy or student life, so we really are guided by that. No new academic buildings are planned or identified in this document based on the growth horizons we anticipate for Crookston. In terms of housing needs for the campus, as it continues to grow, we have some short-term needs we can make, short-term investments we can make to the growth target of 850 students on the campus by working with existing buildings like McCall Hall. And then in the longer term, as Crookston's campus population continues to grow, we would entertain new construction, and that will show up in the final drawings here. The second big idea is to enrich and enhance the 3 quads that exist today on the Crookston campus. They're really defined, quads are defined, of course, by buildings that surround them and the landscape features that have been developed over time. The main quad is the historic quad of that fantastic Northwest Agricultural School. The other is the learning quad, which has been established between Owen and Hill Hall. And the third quad is emerging on the south side of our campus around the student housing. So each of the quads has different needs, but we really believe for this plan, reinvesting in the current places, make them function as best they can for the different purposes they have, is a key piece of how we'll go forward for Crookston's investments. The third big idea is about the working landscape. We had some conversation with you here at your last meeting about that windbreak, and you see in that image on the lower left from the 30s, people understood the severity of the northwest wind, so they planted accordingly. Over time, whether storm or disease, that has thinned out. And so one of the most important pieces of creating a working landscape, it will work to protect people, it will work to shelter buildings, it will work to sequester carbon. It's also fantastic to have, to do planting now and to imagine the legacy that it leaves behind. So working landscape has that connotation for Crookston. It also includes things like building a learning loop, a walking path outdoors for when the weather is favorable, to understand how ecosystems and resources are really being planted and being stewarded on the campus. The fourth big idea is really about campus connections and gateways. It's small things, but they make a big difference. There's a specific place on our campus where a lot of students on a daily basis are crossing a busy county road. That's an improvement we'd like to make. The plan also talks about thinking on how electric vehicles may be a part of our campus features going forward. Where can we put those chargers? How will it serve students, faculty, and staff? The last big idea, somewhat ordered out of sequence, I just realized, is about reimagining space for athletics on the Crookston campus. Athletics is a big part of student life at the Crookston campus. Today, enrollment-wise, 43% of the student body are registered on one of the school's team rosters. Traditionally, that's about 43%. Traditionally, they've been around 35%. So it means a lot of things for Crookston campus relative to practice space and also scheduling of that practice space. So in order of operations, if you will, there's some current investments to be made on fields that are used outdoors. And then there's the prospect of building additional field house space, which is practice and training space for some of those athletes today, already on teams on the school's roster, but also as growth continues into the future for that 850 student target. So that was a quick summary. There's a lot more detail in your docket. I'm going to turn the mic back to Senior Vice Chancellor Johnson at this point.
Okay, so thinking about the near-term horizon, as Monique mentioned, renovations are key in a variety of different sorts of spaces, classroom spaces, other kinds of learning spaces, even administrative spaces. And some of the halls that we have that contribute to that beautiful quad that you see are quite old, and that has a lot of ramifications for the people who work in there. I think most of the regents at one time or another have seen the primary athletic facility, Lysaker Gym, with its famous crack. We always have to talk about the crack. Those structural issues obviously need attention, but there's also need of additional locker rooms and other team spaces, including sports medicine. The current weight room is inadequate for the 290-plus athletes that we have. So these are some kind of short-term things that we really need to act on. Most of the residence halls are in wonderful shape. We've, as a campus, have gotten recognition for the wonderfulness of our housing. However, McCall Hall, which was built in 1941, is structurally sound, but it needs renovations for the upper floors to be usable. We have one floor now that's been put into use this year. Longer term, Skyberg, which was built in 1970, probably is going to need to come down. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shane, who gets to talk about trees.
Chair Hipsch, committee members. So as the Chancellor noted and Director McKenzie noted, it's hard being a tree in the Red River Valley. And it's going to get harder as Emerald ash borer continues to move north. The campus has a number of ash trees on it. So on the rendering here in the north and the west portion of the image, you really see that vision about reestablishing the windbreaks to provide the benefits that Director McKenzie highlighted earlier. And then obviously the other sort of big part of the plan that we talked about with you last time in February, or in December rather, is that, how do we reinvigorate and rejuvenate the existing district energy facility that provides such critical heating services to the campus buildings. In doing that with renewable power, doing it through an electric boiler and a high temperature thermal energy battery storage system that will help us make that transition from fossil fuels to renewable fuels and really launch us into the next part of the 21st century. I'll pass it back to the Vice Chancellor.
As we noted in December, longer term, we need to right-size the campus and create better space alignment to support student, staff, and administrative needs. As our campus evolves, it may be possible to take down outdated and unneeded facilities. This would also allow us to be responsive to our sustainability footprint. Because of the climatic conditions, it is increasingly difficult to be competitive in athletics when our teams are competing against universities that have indoor practice and multi-purpose facilities. Of the 16 teams in the Northern Sun Intercollegiate Conference, we are the only campus that does not have a field house or a large indoor practice and competition arena. We are also one of the most northerly universities in our league. Our long-term horizon also forecasts need for additional housing facilities. We would like an addition to McCall to match demand and consider building new energy-efficient housing, given Skyberg's condition. If new housing near Heritage could be constructed, we would be able to remove Skyberg. We would continue restoration and extension of the windbreaks. That's a long-term project. Any of you who have flown into Grand Forks, which is our nearest airport, you see from the air very clearly the importance of those windbreaks around human habitation. It's very clear. And so for our campus, it's really important. It's been kind of distressing to see trees needing to come down because of the disease. And so that is something where we take a very long-term view. So with that, I will turn it back over to Director McKenzie.
That concludes our presentation. Chair Hipsch, members of the committee, we're happy to stand for questions or for your action.
Thank you. Before we turn to discussion, is there a motion to approve on behalf of the board of the Crookston campus plan?
So moved.
That's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? James?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Hipsch, and thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to add my support, or I guess maybe not saying it that way, but lift up and of course, very supportive as well of the athletics pieces of this. When Regent Verhalen and I were up at Crookston at the end of October for a board engagement visit, the first thing that day was a tour from a bunch of athletics folks up at Crookston. Of those spaces have been on a lot of capital and space tours as part of this role, but that one in particular and all my time on the board really stands out due to the overwhelming at times, and not in a negative way at all, but passion from those folks giving the tour, and just saw very up close and personal the needs that were just described during this presentation and have been talked about in other venues as well. So I think those investments in particular as part of this campus plan are really critical. Everything's critical and important when it comes to capital planning. I know Regent Turner might talk about the heating plant up at Crookston. And I, of course, think that is, clearly there's a lot of ties to safety and need there, but wanted to just kind of put my emphasis on the athletics portion of this and hoping that's something that we can prioritize as we move forward for the Crookston campus, because there's going to be a lot of benefit when it comes to retention and recruitment and remaining competitive for this campus. And thank again I don't have everyone's names in front of me, but thank you to those who gave that tour back in October, because it really was, I think about that tour often as part of this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent Farnsworth. Okay, Regent Turner.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Hipsch. Easy question. Which tree are you going to replace it with? That's my number one. Seriously. I mean, because my whole maternal family is from up there, and I know every farm had their little forest kind of thing. So that's question number one. Are we going to get a tree that won't? Okay.
We will defer to the professional tree people to make that determination for us.
If Regents of the committee, we have a forestry faculty who's at UMC now, who's working with us on trying to make the best informed recommendation for what grows today and what will grow over the long horizon.
There you go. And then I just have to say, Regent Wheeler and I were kind of, when you described the different facilities, and we both kind of looked at each other and going, yeah, when we, the medical facilities for the athletes is dismal at best. And it was kind of, we were both turning to each other going, yeah, that totally needs something. So I would strongly advocate that to be the, coming from health professionals, that would be a huge one, to be able to do something with that. And then, of course, yeah, I can't let it go by, even though our bonding committee, you know, kind of would like to magically change our boiler into a thermal energy, you know, kind of thing that just costs a few dollars, you know. Have we approached like the federal government for any, not that this, the federal government for anything like this kind of in the past year or two? Because that's a huge investment that, you know, they're not interested in anything with coal, but you guys are talking about like a transition kind of thing. Where are we at with that so that, you know, our students don't freeze some winter morning kind of thing?
Chair Hipsch, Regent Turner, so we are looking at funding sources beyond the state and opportunities to tap into federal sources of funds, at, especially among within like the Department of Energy and some of their granting programs, and are in active conversation with the community of Crookston right now about potentially going together on a proposal for that purpose. So,
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you.
Regent Kenyanya.
Thank you. You know, the professional tree people, I think is that they do exist, and a couple of us got to meet them when we went to Cloquet.
We did, that's right.
And the Deep Winter Greenhouse, and the professional tree people are doing awesome things. They're taking trees from southern Minnesota and starting to adapt them up there. So this is, I'm glad they got their shout out. Thank you for the presentation. You know, second time we're having this discussion, and really excited. You know, just on that last conversation, I think we've said this a lot. We're very excited that we're putting climate, you know, at the center of these. And, you know, this is obviously a natural and obvious place, but hope that as we do other initiatives, that climate is front and center, and sustainability as it is here. I think it would be disappointing if we weren't aspirational, as we have been in this plan, but then it'd be irresponsible to, you know, to act in a vacuum, right, and not have all the other pieces fit together in conversations. And you know, you pointed out that this is not committing finances or anything like that. You know, we've been talking a lot about strategic plan, and I bring it up every time, and because we have to, but then I'm like, okay, we still have to move, you still have to do stuff, you know? So I think I understand why we're doing this and why this is here, but then at the same time, you know, the form is to follow function, and the strategic plan will help clarify some function. It's likely that we might revisit this, and I think last time, I think I'm quoting, it was described as a living document, right? Not, it's approved, put it up on a shelf. So, you know, looking forward to see how that evolves and can actually be implemented. We can be more tactical about it. So, you know, very excited about what we have here, you know, but then also just recognizing that as we have conversations about our campuses and strategic plan together with the community, kind of helps us redefine, okay, how exactly do we want the identities to look like across the system, that we may have to come back to this, not even in a bad way. That actually makes it more likely to come to fruition, because now we can tie it back to mission and plans and what we're actually trying to do. Rather, if those two things end up in a different direction, then the plan never gets implemented or whatever. So, looking forward to supporting this, and thank you all for the work.
Thank you, Regent. Anybody else? Hearing none, you appear ready to vote. So all those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, say no. Motion passes. Thank you for another good plan, so. Next topic this afternoon is to discuss the fiscal year 2026 annual operating budget framework. Vice President and Budget Director Julie Thompson will take us through this item. But first, Executive Vice President Goldman, would you kick us off?
Thank you, Chair Hips. Today's discussion is an important step in the development of the university's fiscal year 2026 annual operating budget. Each year, the budget planning process begins with a high-level framework that outlines key revenue and expenditure assumptions, helping to ensure a balanced and strategic approach. This framework focuses on critical funding sources, including state appropriations and tuition, while also considering cost drivers such as inflation, compensation, and strategic investments. Today's presentation takes the conversation to the next step, reminding us of how the framework comes together and how it shapes our plans and the way we view the budget. Building from the conversation in December, we will move more specifically about current estimates of the values for each major budget variable in the framework and walk through an exercise of how these variables can come together to balance the budget. The board's input today will help refine our assumptions as we move forward to the final budget recommendations for fiscal year 2026 in June. With that, I'll turn it over to Vice President Julie Tonneson to walk us through the presentation. Julie?
Good afternoon, Chair Hips, members of the committee. What better day to talk about the budget, right? It is brutally cold, but it is gloriously sunny. So that's a good, we have challenges. We have challenges and we have opportunities, right? We're going to talk about that because we're going to build on the conversation that we had in December when we talked about the basic trend information in revenues and expenditures. The presentation today will be a bit more focused on information necessary to develop the budget framework, information that we can use to make decisions about the FY26 budget. And we'll try to keep some energy in the room as we do this. For this budget cycle, we did discuss the general budget process and the model at a summary level, so I'm not going to repeat all of that information today. But as we walk through these slides and during the discussions, if questions come up about those things, we can, of course, address those in more detail. And of course, despite what I just said, I am going to start by repeating something, but just very briefly. I want to give you the context for where we're sitting within the two-year biennial budget cycle. You will remember that the whole process starts in the summer of an even-numbered year when we build our biennial budget request to the state. We start by creating a high-level planning framework. That's the black box on this chart that sets out our plans for each of the major budget variables in the state and tuition-funded portion of the budget. Those assumptions and plans take us through the odd-numbered year legislative session, which we refer to as the budget year at the Capitol, which has just begun. And simultaneously, they take us through the annual budget process that this time will result in the FY26 budget you will review and take action on in June, once we know what our appropriation is going to be, hopefully. That initial black box set of planning framework assumptions may have to be adjusted prior to the start of the FY27 budget cycle on the bottom arrow here to incorporate what we will know about the FY27 state appropriation and the updated cost information. In that second year of the cycle, we will enter the fall part of the budget process with the understanding that we will need to deliver a recommended budget based on current law, and we will have to decide whether or not to build a second set of options based on a potential supplemental budget request that we could discuss next fall. Now we are in the pink portion of this cycle, about halfway through year one. We've delivered budget instructions to our academic units, and we will start meeting with them in the next few weeks to learn about their needs, challenges, and opportunities. Then we will put together the President's recommended all-funds budget for year review in early June. We will base our recommendations on the robust review we do with all of our units, support and academic, and the decisions we make on the variables that we are discussing here today. To set the stage for our variables discussion, I want to remind everyone what we mean when we talk about the budget framework, or that black box. At its most basic level, it is simply an equation identifying planned or expected increases in resources that must be equal to or greater than planned or expected increases in costs. It's a form of incremental budgeting at a very high level, which proceeds with the expectation that the base budget is balanced, so we can focus our time and effort on making such incremental changes in the budget in order to remain balanced. As I pointed out in the past, the decisions we bring here are focused on the O&M state appropriation and the tuition funds, because that is where leadership decisions have the most impact. I do want to remind everyone that we do not ignore the roughly other 65% of our revenues and corresponding expenditures in building the budget. Those revenues are an extremely important part of the overall plan. But the decisions to be made by leadership simply don't fall there, generally as part of this process. To make this framework part of the budget relevant in real terms, I share with you two quick views. These are actual examples of the approved budget FY25 framework in a framework format. First on this slide, the state O&M and tuition-focused budget framework that you approved last spring. You can see the incremental changes in resources, and you can see the planned incremental new spending. You can also see that the decisions we made to get to these summarized totals remained a balanced budget. And for a second view, from attachment 1 to the approved FY25 budget, the display of all revenues, state appropriation and tuition, plus those revenues beyond the planning framework. These are not the incremental changes for the year, as on the previous slide, but instead represent the new totals for all funds after those incremental changes have been incorporated. For the primary framework funds highlighted in yellow, the results flow from decisions made by the state on our appropriations and by this board regarding tuition rates. And that's just about 1/3 of our projected revenues for the year. For the other funds, the results flow from decisions made by this board related to fees, plus our high-level estimates of changes in the other revenues based on trends and projections built from conversations with units generating these revenues. So for example, it includes projected trend growth in gifts and growth in endowment income based on the returns in recent years, and growth in auxiliary revenues based on the approved housing and dining rates coupled with estimated occupancy, and so forth. What I'm hoping is evident is that the budget framework, or that black box, is one helpful tool in getting to this level of detail and displaying the budget in a meaningful format, talking through the incremental changes to apply to the base for state and tuition funds, and then to arrive at the new full projected revenue and expenditure base requires the conversations that we're having today. And that means focusing on some specific questions related to our immediate plans. Building the framework is an iterative process of asking and answering questions about what to plan as the incremental changes for each major resource and each major expenditure category, the types of questions outlined here. For FY26, we know what we requested as a state appropriation, but as we do each cycle, we need to ask ourselves how we should plan for a potential approval of something other than what we requested. If we get additional funds, how should they be used? And if we don't, how should that impact the other variables? We need to ask what our goals are for tuition rate changes and internal reallocations. What is possible in terms of growth in other revenues to support core operations, or where are there challenges in that arena that we might need the framework funds to address, such as the recent information on potential federal changes in our ICR reimbursement? What are the goals for salary increases, addressing facility needs, launching strategic initiatives, and so on? We started the conversation on these questions in the fall, but during the early part of the cycle, answering them generally leaves us with an imbalanced budget. So we have to go back and make adjustments until the final plans balance the budget in a way that addresses the university's goals in the very best way possible. Given that task before us, today we want to share the next iteration of information that might help in building the estimates necessary to pull it all together. And we'll start with the resource projections, focused on 4 buckets: the state appropriation, tuition revenue, internal budget cuts to reallocate existing dollars, and changes in other revenues. Unadjusted for inflation, the state appropriation for the last 4 biennia has grown, but intermittently. Gains have been realized in year 1 of the biennium with no growth in the second year. As we discussed starting last fall, we thought it would be best to present our request to the state this time in terms of what we need for the whole biennium rather than incrementally for each year. Our request then is for $235 million for the entire biennium, and the state could choose how best any increase would fit into their 2-year plan. There's no automatic increase in our appropriation as we move to the next biennium. We have to actually request, and the state will need to take action to approve any increases or decreases to our base. We need to develop plans for what we will do in the framework if we get those funds. Of the $235 million, if it was distributed across the biennium in a reasonable way to address startup of new initiatives and the natural growth in costs, we would ideally have $110 million, incremental new, in FY26 split into 2 categories. First, an increase of $55 million specifically for our core cost increases in FY26 related to compensation, inflation on goods and services, compliance requirements, evolving student services, urgent facility needs, and so on. Remember that this request was built as a proposed partnership, with the state's $55 million helping to support just 45% of our projected cost to deliver the mission, and the university planning to cover the larger 55% of those critical mission delivery costs. The second piece of the funding requested for the 3 programmatic enhancement areas: the 4 research projects, the health sciences strategic plan implementation, and the student service enhancements. It would be ideal for those to have an additional $55 million in FY26. Under this scenario, we would have $110 million additional state support next year, and the remaining $125 million increase would address those cost items as they grow into FY27. Moving to tuition as the second resource variable, the university has recognized the concerns of students and families related to the price of attaining a post-baccalaureate degree. For most of the last decade, we worked to hold the resident undergraduate rate increases below the rate of inflation on all campuses, exceeding inflation in just 2 of the last 10 years on the Twin Cities campus, and then only by 1%. Due to those past decisions, recent analysis shows that the undergraduate resident tuition rate on the Twin Cities campus is almost $1,000 or 6% less than it was 10 years ago, adjusted for inflation, and that the net price, which is the cost of attendance less aid on the Twin Cities campus, is over $7,000 or 39% less than it was in FY15 for resident undergraduate students from families with adjusted gross income of $110,000 or less, so those with the greatest financial need. And the results are even more dramatic on our system campuses where growth in the student cost has been even less. Our strategy for the Twin Cities non-resident non-reciprocity rate has differed from that for the resident rate. Prior to the pandemic, we increased this rate significantly for incoming freshmen while holding the rate increases for continuing students to no more than 5.5% each year. This strategy moved the rate to the middle of the Big Ten just before the pandemic, but other schools moved purposefully as well, and today we are the 13th highest rate of 18 in that comparison group. Finally, the goal for graduate and professional rates has generally been to hold increases to around the rate of inflation, with variations driven by market considerations, student debt load, program rankings, and so forth. Added all together, assuming stable enrollment, a 1% increase across all rates is estimated to generate roughly $10 million. The question we face is, what should we plan for each of these rate categories for FY26, given our rankings, given inflation, the availability of financial aid, recent trends, the uncertainty of growth in other revenue increases, projected costs, and so forth. Also, on the resource side, we need to decide how much reallocation is necessary and appropriate for the FY26 budget and moving into the future. Reallocation is our internal practice of finding efficiencies or purposely reducing or eliminating expenditures on a recurring basis in order to reinvest existing resources in new things. In some years, we're in the position of implementing exceptionally large expense reductions for two purposes, in part to offset a loss of revenue, such as a reduction in state appropriations or tuition or ICR, and in part as a reallocation to cover cost increases or higher priority investments. This practice happens at all universities, but not all of them incorporate it into their central budget process. They expect units to take these actions, but centrally they may not approve them or may not hear about or in any way track the results of the impact of the cuts. Here, for many years, we have directed the level of required reallocation centrally, and we have made decisions knowing the expected impact of these actions, and we've asked units to report on actual implementation of their communicated plans. In 9 of the last 10 years, we implemented planned reallocations of 1% to 2% of total unit, state, and tuition allocations on a recurring basis. In FY22, our average reallocation across all of our units was the highest in many years at 2.5% due to the uncertainties of the pandemic. The recurring reallocations have not been implemented across the board. Decisions have differed by unit based on their needs and opportunities and their unique financial situations. We have reached a critical point in which traditional changes to our resource levers to ensure balanced budgets while maintaining the strength of all of our mission-driven activities isn't possible. Regardless of the level of increased state funding, we will need to face difficult decisions leading to programmatic and scope changes to eliminate or reduce activities, pull the associated expenses out, and strengthen quality in all that remains. Moving forward, we have to choose how deep to push the budget reductions for FY26 and where to focus and purposely target that effort to avoid the death by 1,000 cuts kind of scenario. Each 1% reallocation target on the traditional base of state and tuition funds reduces existing costs by $22 million, but no scenario can be across the board next year. We have underinvested in some areas that will require protection from cuts, and we will have to make some difficult programmatic scope reduction decisions in other areas. Some mix of savings from efficiencies and savings from deciding to do less program, both will be necessary. We're working through different planning scenarios, including some that anticipate scope reductions in our academic units of up to 7%. Finally, the last category of planned resource changes can be for the other revenues in our portfolio. There are fewer central decisions to be made here, but as we go through the budget process and learn from our units what they're seeing as opportunities for net growth, we will factor those additions into meeting our challenges. We will ask our managers to first cover cost increases for the activities generating those revenues, but then we'll look for the chance to apply growth here to increase costs historically covered by state and tuition funds. As I mentioned in the December meeting, this does include the possibility for units to apply tuition revenue coming in over budget this year in next year to cover next year's costs, and we will do that whenever possible. It's too soon to know what to count on for this category, but generally these revenues have helped to ease the pressure on the other resource variables rather than being a source that drives investment decision. And of course, sometimes we have to pay attention to the negative impacts happening in those funds as well, and we would have to address those with similar decisions. So next, I will lay out some summary information related to the expenditure variables before jumping into some example scenarios. And we'll start that summary of expenditures with the core. For budget planning, we often think of our expenditures in two groups. These must-dos to keep our current operations in a strong position, and then targeted investments to enhance programs and services. In this core category, the primary spending obligations center around these three items. For FY26, compensation and providing a meaningful pay increase to our employees will remain a significant spending category. We must remember that whatever plans we implement for pay increases impacts all of our funds. So while here we talk about how to cover those costs through internal budget cutting, tuition, or state appropriation increases, we have to ask all the other revenue-generating activities to cover whatever the cost will be through increased revenues where possible or budget cuts. There are routinely 2 annual cost components to consider. How much will a given increase to the general salary pool for all employees cost for next year? And will we have any required adjustments even if there was no increase in that salary pool? For the latter, we would see an increase of just $2.6 million across all funds for required step adjustments and minor fringe rate changes. For the former, each 1% increase in the salary pool for all employees will add another $30 million in cost, roughly $15 million in both the other funds category and in the state and tuition funds combined. And for the benefits and other compliance changes we talked about in December, plus to address market concerns or other goals related to workforce reinvestment, we're estimating an additional $10 to $15 million increase for next year. For facilities and technology infrastructure, it looks like our required inflationary increases on the facility side are once again higher than the CPI. An 8% increase in utilities is projected and a 20% increase in debt service costs. For the technology infrastructure, the annual licensing and maintenance cost increase of over $2.5 million is in the normal trend range, but that trend continues to inch upward every year. And we have reached a point where we must address facility repair and renovation needs across all our campuses. So while we have identified in here as a required cost, we haven't yet decided how much we can add to that pool. We'll continue to discuss that need as we build the full budget over the next several months. Even without that, the costs in this category will increase $20 million plus. And finally, for general inflation on the things that we buy, if the cost increases are minimal, units will manage them within the normal ups and downs in their budget, using balances and reserves or relying on regular budget savings from turnover and fewer or different purchases to cover these increases. If the projected cost increases in this area are significant for some units, they become part of our discussions on where to apply our discretionary resources. Brutally cold, right? But that discretionary resource side, here's the sun. Here's the sunny part, which is the focus of this slide. An important budget variable really for any university is what it plans for advancing the work of the institution to the next level in terms of quality, impact, and service. Planning for a minimum investment pool beyond the core costs I just talked through of roughly $35 to $50 million would allow us to address the highest priority items in this bucket. That number has grown in recent years as we're working to emerge from a period of little to no investment in critical mission functions that simply can't limp along any longer without serious consequences. And to advance our work even further, to take advantage of opportunities to make our mark and achieve the prominence our strategic plan will strive for, we will need to invest even more. The magnitude of budget available for this cannot be considered in isolation. It is directly impacted by the combination of all of the other variables. For example, if a large investment in salary increases is a priority, or if we must dedicate more resources to keeping the lights and the heat on, and we cannot cut budgets deeper than we've already planned, then this investment pool for program and its corresponding support infrastructure will necessarily be constrained. But this is where we ask ourselves, what do we want to be known for, and what does it take to make that leap forward for the good of the institution, and thus for all those we serve on our campuses and across the state? How much must we accommodate in the budget? Which is a good transition to talking about scenario planning. To pull it all together, we want to show you two things: the primary variables we need to make decisions about, all on one slide, as we've done in the past, and some example hypothetical budget frameworks to demonstrate how those decisions can lead to a plan. So first, the variables. These are the primary budget variables to consider for next year, the resources on the left and the costs on the right. Again, this is focused on the framework funds of state appropriation and tuition. Some of the math in this table is pretty simple, but we wanted to give you some basic building blocks for questions or scenario playing if you so choose. There's very little that we know or that is definite at this point. On the resource side, we do know the state appropriation increase is $0 in current law, but we need to wait to see if we will get an appropriation increase and how much it will be. If our full request was funded, as I mentioned earlier, we would dedicate $110 million of the $235 total to this first year of the biennium. Beyond that, we need to decide what to do and what to plan for our tuition revenues and our internal reallocations. Some basic values at different levels are displayed here for those. On the cost side, we know that we will face an increase in our compensation costs of $1.3 million for step increases for eligible employees and some costs due to minor changes in our fringe rates. On top of that, each 1% increase in the pool for all employees adds $14.6 million to our cost. It looks like the minimum cost increases for facilities and technology, totaling roughly $23 million in the lower right quadrant of this chart, are known. The other numbers on this slide are estimates attached to different assumptions. Now for the hypothetical example scenarios. On this slide, we've displayed two different example frameworks using information from the previous table. Please note that what we actually end up with will not be any of these exactly as you see them, or probably any variation that we could talk about today. They're meant to show you that making decisions for a variable on one row has a direct impact on the other rows. You can see that in both examples, there are certain cost items that remain the same, lines 16, 18, and 19. But you can also see that the ability to provide a salary increase and to provide programmatic service and strategic investments can change considerably depending on the resource decisions above. Example 1 assumes full state funding of our request on lines 5 and 6. And consistent with the partnership aspect of that proposal, it includes a modest tuition increase and reallocation level on the part of the university. The gray rows have little to no flexibility, but in this scenario, we could choose a 4% increase in the salary pool and just over $50 million of new investments on lines 21 and 22. This version reflecting a modest phase-in of funding for the strategic plan items. Moving to example 2, we have made different choices. In this version, we receive half of our state request, and we chose to increase our program and strategic investments more than in example 1. Those pieces combined led to a bump up in the tuition rates, a significant increase in our planned reallocations, moving into the scope reduction actions for sure, and a slightly smaller increase in the salary pool. There are many combinations that we could model, and we have, and we will. The picture at this 30,000-foot level is a guide that can provide a starting point from a planning perspective. As I mentioned earlier, we're halfway through our task of meeting with all the units across the university to determine what their challenges and opportunities are, and we'll learn a lot through that process that allows us to continually refine these variables until we get down to the final version that the president wants to recommend to you for approval. It's a whole process of learning about the final appropriation, learning about external impacts on our budget, and gaining an understanding of unit-level budgets, combined with the goals of the institution, that helps us to make decisions on the variables and arrive at a final balanced version. Your thoughts and your input throughout that process, including today, is part of our regular tweak and repeat cycle, and it helps us to shape the answers to the variable questions I laid out earlier. So if you have any thoughts today about any of the variables, we would be happy to engage in that conversation, and that ends my comments, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for the presentation. And you really simplify it. It's very complicated. You make it seem simple, but it's, I know you do a lot of work on it, so thank you. So I expect that Regents may have questions regarding the potential change to the indirect cost rate on National Institutes of Health Awards and how that would impact our budget. So before we turn to those questions, let's start with any discussion related to the fiscal year 2026 budget that Vice President Tonneson just presented. Are there any questions or comments for Vice President Tonneson at this point? Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Hips. It's been building, the whole reallocation of units, and I feel that pain because I don't know where we go from there with especially anticipating further reductions within the whole scope and no legislative funding. Brutally cold, I think, is an understatement, perhaps, I hate to say. But, I think we have to be looking at your leap forward scenario, we have to look toward that future. What is it we want to be? I mean, it's the same conversation we had this morning, and it's going to be a hard, difficult strategic plan, let alone budget for the biennium. I don't have any advice, and I've got millions myself, but not to this extent that this institution needs to attend to. So I guess I feel your pain. I feel our pain. I feel our students' pain, because I think it's a shared pain, and everybody's in it. And I think I have confidence in the administration to look at everything holistically and in the future, and to get to the best decisions that we can for our community.
President Cunningham.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julie and Chair Hipsch, and thank you for that, also Regent Davenport. So I think I really like the way you set it up. It is cold, and it may be cold for quite some time, but we still have to make the sun come out. So we have to, just to sum up what everybody knows, we historically have not invested in our facilities. We historically have not invested in our people. And, that sort of comes home to roost now. So we knew it was coming, and it has. So we have to be able to, we have to make strategic investments going forward. While we still deal with the budget realities and the money we may or may not get from the state. Either way, I just want to give you some sunshine. We can be a great university. We can do it faster with more state support. I'll say that clearly, and with less pain by everyone shared. But we still can do those things, which is why, as was pointed out in the prior slide, we are asking our units to take a hard look, not at the 1,000 cuts of 1%, but what actually scope would look like to do differently. And that's different, and I want to give our academic leaders and our provost and all of our units, a lot of shout out for that hard work to be done. But you can not only cut towards your future, that will lead us with mediocrity of both people and buildings and facilities, and will not lead us to a modern university. In the absence of substantially more funding, or even the funding that we ask for likely from the state, and even if we got funds from the state, honestly, we still have to begin to invest in our facilities, to work on paying our people what they need to have a fair compensation, and work to have strategic funds to be able to invest towards a future in areas that will continue to have us lead. And that will lead to hard decisions and hard choices. And what I would ask it will also lead in all of these scenarios. I'm very straightforward. We will need to raise tuition. How much we raise tuition depends on how much we get from the state. But in every scenario here, we have underinvested for so long, there is not a possibility of not raising tuition. But I think what I ask this board to consider and to continue to talk to us about is, with this, whenever anything has to be reallocated, that's difficult for people and for units and for work. And we will simply have to do that work, and we will all hear about that, and all work is really important. However, as the conversation this morning, if we're gonna strategically move towards a future in a resource-constrained environment, while having good buildings and people that are getting paid what they deserve, we're going to have to make hard choices. So I really appreciate the lot of work that's gone into this, and the work EVP Goldman and Vice President Tomlinson and I met with our academic leaders in a 2 or 3 hour meeting a week and a half ago to sort of review scenarios with them, really bring them fully into partnership and how together we think about building a great university. But I don't want us to get stuck in a mentality of there isn't money, therefore we can't do anything, and we just have to sink into hopelessness and cold, dark mediocrity. That's not the answer. If the answer is we have to work together, make hard decisions, and think strategically. So thank you so much.
Thank you, President. I just would like to add to your comments. I think one of the things that we have to prove to the legislature is that it's an investment that we're making, and an investment has a return, and the return is taxes. And I mean, the money we spend here turns into tax almost immediately, and because we're so innovative and we're the economic engine of the state. So if they cut us, they're going to cut their taxes and they're going to cut off their nose to spite their face. So, we have to prove that to them time and time again. And so I think we need to invest more in government relations and public relations, and we need to get that word out there. And we haven't done that as much as we should do it, I don't think. And the other area that I think a lot of money is going to come in to our organization is through endowments and through gifts. And so we need to support the UMF, and we need to support the alumni, our 680,000 alumni that are going to start on a giving thing, because I think that's the future of public education, is going to be less government and more private, whether we like it or not. I mean, it's like, when I was going to school, I think they paid like 60% of the cost, and now what are they, 14%? So, I mean, and I'm not that old, really. I'm old, but I'm not super old, So, I mean, it's like, anyway, so I think that's going to be a thing that I don't think we can just hang our hat on the government for any kinds of funds, and we'll get into the NIH discussion in a minute, but.
Regent, if I may, the new statistic out is every dollar the state gives us, we actually return a dollar. So that's our latest impact. Plus, we also deliver $11.5 billion of economic impact to the state every year. We will continue to sing all of those things, quite loudly and quite broadly. And but I still want us to work together to create the future that we would like to plan to see together.
Great message, thank you. Regent Turner and then Regent Farnsworth.
Yep. Thank you, Chair Hipsch. I just want to acknowledge, last year when we didn't get any state funding at all, I reluctantly voted for the 4.5% or whatever percent, and knowing that is a real hardship for our students. And so, but it's very frustrating and cold and cloudy to see that we'll probably be in that same, the governor's budget didn't even have us listed, not even a token high, and it's very frustrating to see that same kind of a increase. And I just want to acknowledge, it is a real shame because the students do bear the brunt of it. And I just want that acknowledged. I don't need a comment or anything, but I do want them to know that we acknowledge their sacrifice.
And Chair Hipps and Regent Turner, if I may, and I think historically here, we have protected the students at a level to our workforce not getting the increases that they need. And that was pointed out very eloquently last year by Mark B. And so now, we look at the compensation as Mark B presented last year across, that's how we've done that. We've also been able to protect historically more tuition increases by simply putting no money aside for our facilities or repairs.
I get it.
And I can't come in front of you in good conscience and say we don't have to do, even with HEAPR, we're going to have to be investing in some buildings, and we have to also invest in our employees at the same time while trying to do good work with our students. And then I'll also just forever remind people that although the top line tuition number is going to look a certain way for families, we do a really good job here protecting our families that are the least resourced, that $110,000 group we're still the most affordable in the state for that. So even though the tuition numbers goes up, we do a very good job with financial aid and scholarships here to keep our students that really need that the most, this a great opportunity and good value for them here.
Follow up.
Regent Turner.
The reason I brought it up is so that you could say everything that you did, and this is not a criticism at all coming from you. This is, if legislators are listening, that's why I put the blame.
Yeah, it's a partnership.
Yep.
Good point, and good point on the tuition as well. Regent Farnsworth.
Thank you, Chair Hipsch. I'll just make a few points, trying not to be redundant or repeating what folks have said. Would agree with you, Chair Hipsch, around this again is another example of the importance of investing in that government relations support. Really, I like these presentations that have come to us in the past, but today's presentation in particular on this modeling and continuing to keep the board informed. Again, this may have happened in the past as well, but great to hear about that academic leaders meeting that President Cunningham was just talking about. I think that's really important to be able to demonstrate that collaboration early on and often throughout the whole process, and making sure those voices are heard from across the university as this modeling happens. Of course, it's important for the board to be involved in this, but there's all sorts of other groups that want to and should be involved in the budgeting process, and so great to hear that. And then also, the topic was about the next section of our what we're about to move to, so I won't comment on that. But I think it's relevant to mention here President Cunningham's testimony at the legislature yesterday, speaking really clearly to the national impacts, how those relate to our budget. I've been to many university committee hearings over the years and found that messaging from the person in your chair, you, particularly compelling and helpful. So thank you for that. And I'll just echo the last point that was made about this certainly needs to continue to be a partnership with the legislature. I know it's the lack of state support, the changes in state support are frustrating, but I think particularly during the legislative session, want to be careful about how we frame that and just continue to lean into the positive partnership and opportunities that we have with support of the university in the many different ways that our university gets support from the legislature. So thank you.
Thank you, Regent Farnsworth. Does anyone else have any discussion? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to Vice President Goldman and Vice President Tonneson. Would you like to take us through the possible impact of the potential change to indirect cost rate on National Institutes of Health awards? In other words, we're putting together puzzles this afternoon. That's how fun this is, right?
Love puzzles.
Not sure what the weather analogy would be for that, other than storm clouds coming. So certainly I'd like to yield the floor to President Cunningham, but just some rough numbers for context. As everybody knows, our current indirect rate is 54%. The proposed change to the indirect rate is down to 15%. So, and this is just for NIH, and that would be $100 to $130 million impact per year just for NIH. That doesn't include NSF, doesn't include DOD, doesn't include all of the other agencies that, if this gets traction, would just be budgetarily devastating. It would be a tsunami coming from that. The impact, the way we budget, as Julius describes so eloquently over time, is this RCM approach. So that reduction would hit our schools and colleges dramatically. What's important to remember is the amount of work that goes into what I would call the back office side of supporting funded research. Be it paid at 54% or 15%, the work is no less. So somebody said, well, then you just have less people supporting the grants. But the reality is the grant is the grant. The support of the grant is the support of the grant. So there's no words that I can find that could adequately articulate the devastation that $100 to $130 million. We look at bottom right, you look at the numbers Julia's talked about. It would make the lack of support by our state in our budget trivial to compare to what this would be across. And certainly I would like to yield to President Cunningham, who knows this area so well.
Chair Hipsch, and thank you, EVP Goldman. And even to take us up one higher level, I'm sure everybody in this room at some point has received medicine or a cure or treatment that had its foundational roots in NIH work, and many of that could be work even done here at the university over time. So the first thing to remember is a cut like this is a cut to fundamental medicine, cures, and biomedical advances for people across the country and in our state directly. We have multiple missions here. Certainly education and research are two of them. A cut of this kind is, as EVP Goldman said, it's a cut to research itself. There's some confusion about what that overhead is. And we've talked in this group already about how we're the lowest in the Big Ten for our overhead rate. Our peers actually get more, which helps them build their facilities, helps them buy better equipment, all of those pieces. But you can't, it's a, since post-World War II, we've basically, the university community across the country, the research enterprises across the country have had a contract, a handshake with the federal government. And with that handshake, in addition to the grant support, there was funding for the research infrastructure that's needed. So what does that mean? It means it's great to give a research grant to faculty, Faculty Joe, but if Faculty Joe doesn't have the research building for which to do the work in, or the research materials or equipment to do the work in, there is no research. So a cut to that kind of work is actually a fundamental cut to research itself. That would absolutely devastate the ability to take any research at all, because there would fundamentally not be the mechanisms to support it and continue it. So this would devastate the biomedical enterprise. This is not a political issue, as I said yesterday, and our colleagues across the AAU, across states of a variety of political components, all have the same conclusion. This would be devastating to their research enterprises, and the reason we feel strongly to speak up against it is because it doesn't matter where a cut comes from, a cut of this magnitude that would devastate biomedical research and our ability to impact life-saving cures and treatments across the state and country would be devastation to our mission. The other part in this room that we have to understand about our mission is we train over 9,000 graduate students every year, not to mention another, I believe, 8,000 professional students. They train in research facilities on research grants with research equipment that's paid for by these funds. And our facilities are already, as we know, not in the condition that we think they need to be. And this would directly impact our ability to do training for our students, certainly across Minnesota and the country, who come here for graduate education, which typically involves research education with our facilities, on our grants, and with our equipment. So tremendous impacts. This was paused yesterday by legal action. So we are in a holding pattern. However, that's just for what was issued before. It's still an unknown question what will happen going forward. And I think that's something we're all going to have to keep our eye on. As EVP Goldman said, these funds typically come in now, and they were in that revenue source on the right side. They go to the schools now and do work on their facilities and on their buildings, and also pay for things like data security, data infrastructure. It's no good to give people research to do if there's nowhere to put the data that's collected that's secure to be able to analyze it and do more. So it simply would be a dramatic change for research in the country, and a terrible cut to our mission.
Thank you. Just a quick question. So like research that takes 10 years to do or something, or 5 years, and you're halfway through it and it stops, that would all stop, and then we waste the money that we spent, right, as a society? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, we are still trying to figure out how things, what exactly would have to stop, or what would have to be cut back. But it certainly can interrupt many programs that are going on and our ability to continue them. In addition to that, even though the federal order from a week and a half ago on all of our federal funds having riders on them around the new Green Deal and around DEI, that federal order was also paused, yet our individual faculty are receiving stop work orders on an assortment of grants, on grants related, on a wide variety of grants. We're cataloging those, our VPR is cataloging those and trying to understand, but that funding, it could be shut off. It was being, in some cases, told that it will be shut off immediately. We're examining the legality of that and trying to understand if we need to actually stop them or if they can keep spending, and we're working closely with general counsel on that. But that would devastate, projects immediately, and could potentially interrupt, life-saving clinical trials and life-saving other work that's going on, as well as I'm hearing from postdocs and graduate students that are worried that their grant funding will be essentially cut, and they are unclear how they would be able to continue their training immediately. And our community is very worried. And I think right now our message to the community broadly is the legality of these things are being sorted out right now today. They should continue to do their work, except for the specific stop orders that our VPR is hearing about. We're working on those, but otherwise people should continue to do their work while we work to understand what the future state is. But it's an uncertain time.
Thank you. Regent Farnsworth?
Yeah, really briefly, Chair Hipsch, and thank you, President Cunningham. This was a version, I think, of the testimony I was talking about being excited about yesterday. Not excited that we have to have this conversation, but I think you speak to this issue well. And speaking of that, I mean, besides everything you just presented, this just seems to me like, well, one, underscoring that not even bipartisan, but nonpartisan issue here that we're dealing with. And it just seems like something that higher education, trustees, regents across the country would, can and should be joining in collectively on that message. And I know, we are a part of at least one professional association through this role, which or maybe since I've been around, I haven't seen that type of organizing through that, or maybe it wouldn't be the right fit there, but there's another venue for this. I've certainly, as an individual, connected with other trustees on various issues during my time, and this one just seems like it might be interesting to have some action there. I don't know how that would get done and who would start it and carry that. So I'm just saying that broadly because I just thought of it now. But that seems like an area where governing board members can join in support of administration and other folks that are doing this work to help carry those messages. Many of us across the country, elected by policymakers that are involved in this, at the state level, but then feeding into this as a national level thing. But I think folks can kind of see the through line that I'm getting at here. So that's something I would add, and thanks again for highlighting this today as part of our conversation.
If I may, Chair Hipsch and Regent Farnsworth, our national professional organizations have indeed taken this up. So the AAU, again, which is really our representative of research universities across the country, has taken this up and taken action against it. APLU, a number of the broad universities across the country are indeed banding together and adding their voices to this in a way to move and advance the issue forward.
Just really quick.
Yes.
Sorry, no, I appreciate that. I meant our professional organization like AGB
No, I
or
just
other.
wanted you to know.
Yeah, no, that's great too. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Regent Wheeler?
Yeah, thank you for that. And one of my questions is going to be about what's the rise up, because this is directly targeting our very core mission of our organization. It's devastating, what this would mean to so many that that the opportunities for faculty, for students, for the community, and for long term. I think of an engineering student back in the day who was a student here named Earl Bakken, and but for Earl Bakken and his opportunities at the University of Minnesota, we wouldn't have Medtronic. And all the millions of patients who have been saved by what was created there. These are the kinds of things that were the opportunity costs of this are great, and it's an assault on our core mission. So I appreciate you talking about how we're going to rise up collectively, because this just is not the society or the mission in which we want to live.
Thank you. Regent Mayor?
Yeah. Couple questions, and this is driven by, I think, communications that we're getting or in the media, or even when the order came down. Part of the rationale is, well, the private sector can do this with 0, or the private sector can do this with 15%, and therefore, so can institutions of higher learning do it at 15%, as opposed to what they're currently get. If you could address that, and then I have a second question that I think will really get you going.
Chair Hipsch and Regent Mayron. So the overwhelming amount of our research, first of all, is federally funded research. So that builds the core infrastructure that we have. A small amount of private funding, if we name, the Joyce Foundation or we name other funding, is accepted at a lower rate. Typically, that's not the type of research that requires vast new machines, data infrastructure, building, and the only reason we can accept it is because this infrastructure exists. So in fact, the private industry is piggybacking on the vast federal investment that's made, which is one of the ways we then help drive the economy out by supporting that further work. Also, private industry picks up biomedical research predominantly when it's at the next stage. Universities do foundational research to come up with the material for what eventually went into your cell phone screen in a lab 25 years ago, and then that moved away along the chain, and then a private industry picks it up and commercializes it often after it was rolled out of a university and turns it into business. But that foundational research that's done is the business of research universities, and there's never been, the private industry has never picked all of that up. The contract has been with the federal government for foundational funding. Does that answer that question?
If I can ask my second question.
Yeah, if I might add, actually, one more thing, Regent Mayron, when times are tight, actually, and I saw this at my last institution, in various departments at different times, we turned away, actually, grants that were at 15% because they don't even pay for themselves. So the other answer is we won't be able to take those either because they're costing the university too much to be able to administer it. It easily takes twice that just to administer the grants, let alone the investment for the buildings and the facilities.
Okay, thank you. So let me share with you a communication that I received. It actually came in today, having to do with the indirect costs. And I think it would help for us but those who are listening to it to understand your view on this, because I think you are incredibly knowledgeable. So this individual indicated that the first item this individual said is the 50% plus rate often cited doesn't apply to all grants, maybe not even most. I think you just addressed that in fact, because most of our funding is federal, it in fact does apply to most of the grants we receive. But that was the first point this individual made.
So the response to that is overwhelmingly our negotiated rate currently right now with the NIH is at 54%. We do, for the good of education, accept some grants from the NIH that are training grants. For example, they're a loss leader to the university. They cost us a lot of money for things like training graduate students or training some postdocs. We accept a rate of 8%. I know many institutions that won't accept like K awards, as they're called, because they can't afford them at that rate. But the vast majority of of the actual research work that is accepted from the NIH is certainly at 54%.
And I take it embedded within this is that most of our grants are coming through the NIH.
The NIH federal funding is the largest portion of our total research portfolio, and the NIH is our biggest funder of federal research.
Okay. This individual then indicated indirect costs cover building maintenance, utilities, infrastructure required to allow the research to be conducted without interruption. No faculty salary should be at risk. The costs recovered should be transferred to primary general operating account, which pay these costs. And he closed by saying, if indeed there are millions at stake, I would think that it would be the revenue line items it should be addressed in the revenue line items in the annual maintenance budget.
First of all, we don't really have an annual maintenance budget, rest in our last part of our conversation.
Right. Yep.
So that's a problem in and of itself. The second part is if the schools, if all of a sudden we have $130 million less revenue coming into the schools, then the equipment can't be bought. Either we don't need those faculty anymore to do the research because there is no equipment or no labs to be in them, or we have to figure out some way to help with that, which of course would drive up costs dramatically everywhere else. So then our choices would either be not doing any of that research, at which point that would tremendously affect faculty. There'd be a lot of faculty that wouldn't have jobs. We wouldn't have a research enterprise. Or we'd have to figure out some way, I certainly cannot commit to this, EVP Goldman would have strong words for me, that we could somehow make up the $130 million a year. That's not likely. But if it was, that would certainly come out of all kinds of budgets and affect all kinds of other issues that are mentioned in the general operating budget. So it would have a devastating impact, and that's an increasing impact, right? Because we plan on getting more and more research every year. Our research goes up 8% each year, so that would be less funds that we would get every year going forward. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Johnson.
Yeah, just one point I want to make. This has been a very intense day all through, and this might be the most intense part. But I just took a quick look at something I hadn't had a chance to check before and found out that RFK Jr. has been approved today to be our Secretary of Health and Human Services. So that's going to have some impact on decisions, policies. I hope there aren't going to be serious vaccine problems, and we'll be not looking for children, treating children get polio or something. It's a worrisome, okay, say.
And Regent Johnson, Chair Hips, I do believe that I got a text this morning that Mike Lauer, who's the head of the NIH, stepped down this morning. So I think that's a change as well.
A lot of turmoil. Okay, I think that concludes our discussion. You turned the fun meeting into not so fun, so. Next month will be fun again, so.
There's sun.
Find sunshine.
We'll try to find some sun.
Okay, sounds good. So next we will consider the consent report. Executive Vice President Goldman, will you summarize the items in today's report?
Perfect. Thank you, Chair Hips, members of the committee. The February consent report includes several items for your consideration. First, we seek approval to update the Central Reserve budget for fiscal year 2025. The adjustment increases the planned allocations from Central Reserves by $2 million for the cost of the Northrop East Parplet wall repair project not covered by insurance. The project was an emergency repair addressing significant snow and ice damage that occurred following winter storms in 2023. This adjustment increases the total Central Reserve allocations previously approved at $52.7 million to $54.7 million and reduces the projected year-end balances in the reserve to $116.5 million. Next, we have three purchases requiring board approval. A $1.2 million contract for annual asphalt maintenance on the Twin Cities campus, with options for extension for a total value of $6 million. This will provide essential repairs to heavily used roads and parking areas, extending the lifespan of the campus infrastructure. A contract estimated at $32 million for a health exchange marketplace for Medicare enrolled retirees, which is a cost neutral as it will be paid for by retirees to the university and provides them with an access to a broader range of health plans. A $13.5 million long-term service agreement with GE Verona Operations LLC to maintain the combustion turbines and generator at the main energy plant on the Twin Cities campus. Selected through a competitive RFP process, this agreement ensures reliable operation of the plant, which provides steam, electricity, and chilled water across campus. This would be funded through the central utility cost pool. Finally, we request approval for an off-cycle tuition rate adjustment for the Carlson School of Management Masters of Science and Finance program, which runs on a summer start cycle rather than fall start. These increases align with strong enrollment demand and ensure continued competitiveness with the program ranked among the top in the U.S. and globally. As noted in the docket materials, this report comes with the President's recommendation.
Thank you. Now, before I invite a motion to approve the consent report, you are welcome to ask questions, make comments, or ask for an item to be separated out from the report to be voted on separately. Are there any questions, comments, or requests to separate an item out? Okay, hearing none. Is there a motion?
So moved.
It's okay. I was going to finish saying my sentence, but you already did it.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just kidding.
The time.
Everybody knew what I was going to say, so. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Okay, motion passes. So our final is informational items. Executive Vice President Goldman, anything to highlight?
Thank you, Chair Hips and members of the committee. The information items includes 3 reports, which I will briefly summarize. First, the Capital Appropriations Expenditure Report provides an update on projects funded through the Higher Education Asset Preservation and Replacement, HEAPR, and other state capital investments. This report reinforces the university's commitment to responsible stewardship of state funding and ongoing improvements to our facilities. Next is a contamination remediation report, details the university's work with the U.S. Department of Defense to address contamination at the former Gopher Ordnance work site in Rosemont, Minnesota. Following a $13 million settlement in 2024, the university is preparing a response action plan for submission to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency this year, prioritizing remediation efforts in areas undergoing redevelopment. Additionally, the preliminary report on unemployment insurance aid outlines reimbursable unemployment costs for non-exempt university employees furloughed between academic terms. This full fiscal year comparison is expected later in 2025. Mr. Chair, this concludes my remarks on information items.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, there being no additional business, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.